This is Harvest Moon Homecoming, Sweet Haven Farm Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 1. Written by Jesse Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 6. Chapter 11. Fink's feet hurt, his back ached, and he was starving by the time things slowed down around 7. But he'd had fun. Several old, large red maple trees, their leaves a brilliant orange, shaded the shop, and he'd spent 30 minutes jumping in a big pile of fallen leaves with a group of toddlers. He hadn't had that much fun in ages. Crisp fall air, brilliant blue sky, perfect bright orange trees still frosted with green, a whiff of wood smoke and hot dogs, brisk exercise and the laughter of children. Life was good. He was tired, sore, and dirty, but happy, joyful in a way he hadn't been in a long, long time, since before he'd left the farm. He'd been surprised to see dozens of kids from the high school there, too. The place could almost be considered a hangout. Kids seemed to love the corn maze, and many of them spent several hours hanging around the fire. He'd even seen some of them jumping in the leaves after he'd gone to help a family carry pumpkins from the patch. His heart had swelled to see how they'd accepted Wyatt. Of course, that might have had something to do with Harper. Smart and popular, she'd helped Wyatt fit in fast at his new school. And as Fink worked throughout the afternoon and evening, she kept Wyatt busy with jobs that allowed him to be near her and also interact with the other teenagers loitering around the farm. A family with several small children pulled in and walked to the pumpkin patch. The mother carried an infant. The father had a toddler on his hip. Their other 2 small children ran around through the pumpkin patch, laughing and falling. Fink let them alone for a while, but kept an eye on them, and when the father tried to juggle the toddler in one hand and pick up a pumpkin in the other, Fink walked out and offered to help. 10 minutes later, they had at last made their final decisions, and he balanced 4 pumpkins in his arms, using his chin as a levering agent to keep them from tumbling out. He started picking his way back. 2 ladies walked down the path, and he stepped aside to allow them to pass. An itch on his cheek distracted him. "Mr. Finkenbinder?" He froze, his cheek pressed to a pumpkin, and still itchy. But he quickly forgot about that because he was pretty sure the voice was Dr. Rothschild's. As he turned his head to look, he straightened, trying to appear as scholarly as possible. "Dr. Rothschild, how nice to see you." Flat out lie. She wrinkled her nose. "Mrs. Rosenkrantz, this is Mr. Finkenbinder, our high school principal." The lady Dr. Rothschild had introduced looked much more relaxed than her host. She smiled, a genuine, friendly smile, and waved back at a man and 4 children straggling along behind her. "Hey, honey, this is the school principal." She said school principal like a teenaged girl might have said some hot movie actor's name. She even giggled and kind of bounced with her knees. They couldn't be the VIPs Dr. Rothschild had said were coming for the weekend. "I was just helping out here so Mrs. Bright could help paint the float." Fink wasn't sure why he felt compelled to explain to Dr. Rothschild. Most assuredly, it had to do with the superintendent position, and possibly guilt over Ellie. Although he had no reason to feel guilt over Ellie. He closed his mouth. The man caught up to his wife, and their kids crowded around. 2 of the children looked old enough to be in the high school, which housed the 7th through 12th grades, since there was no middle school. "I see." Dr. Rothschild muttered.
"Hey, Mr. F., need some help with those?"
Harper jogged up, with Wyatt following behind. They grabbed the pumpkins from Fink while he pointed to the family to whom they belonged.
"No problem. We'll take care of them."
Harper started walking away, but Wyatt stopped in front of the oldest boy. "Hey, don't I know you from somewhere?" he asked. The boy squinted, then his eyes widened in recognition.
"You're Wyatt. We skied together in the Andes. You were on my soccer team."
"Yeah, and you're Richard." Wyatt couldn't throw an arm around him since he held two pumpkins, but he said,
"Come on up to the shop with me. We'll catch up."
The boy strode off, his mouth moving the whole time. His parents gave each other a concerned look. "I think they'll be fine. That was my nephew," Fink said.
"He seems to be recovering well from his mother's death,"
Mrs. Rosencrantz said. "You knew my sister?"
"She occasionally worked at our ski resort in the town of Farallones in the Andes Mountains of Chile."
Fink stood and talked to the Rosencrantzes for a good half hour, finding out that they loved his sister, and she had been well liked in Chile, and that Wyatt had been especially beloved. They also mentioned they sold their ski resort so their children could graduate from schools in America, but they wanted to all be together, and they also wanted to settle in a rural area.
"This town seems ideal,"
Mrs. Rosencrantz said.
"And finding Wyatt here. We didn't know the name of the town you lived in, but your sister talked about visiting you and how beautiful Pennsylvania is this time of year. She was absolutely right."
Dr. Rothschild made a show of glancing at her watch.
"It's almost closing time. We'll be seeing Mr. Finkenbinder tomorrow."
She ushered them toward the pumpkin patch with promises of catching up more at lunch the next day. Fink went to the pole building to empty the apple bobbing tubs and tidy up, relieved the Rosencrantzes seemed to be nice people and had really seemed enthused about their small community. The school board should be happy to hear that. By the time he stepped into the shop/office, the campfire was out and the last customer was pulling out of the parking lot. Esther shooed him out, saying she would take care of the cash register and cleaning up, and asking him to take soup from the crock pot in the kitchen down to the shed for Ellie.
"When she gets her head in an art project, she doesn't remember to come up for air, let alone food," Esther said.
Fink thought about that as he walked from the shop to the house. Ellie definitely had an artist's personality. They were opposites. They'd drive each other crazy. Opposites attract. Which, of course, explained why he had such a hard time ignoring his feelings. The crazy pull that she had on him. Why he couldn't stop thinking about her kiss. Couldn't stop wanting to kiss her again. He really needed to get a handle on this runaway attraction. Brushing a last clinging leaf off his pants pocket with his elbow, he pushed open the shed door, careful not to spill the bowls of beef stew. Ellie stood on the wagon with her back to him, her hourglass figure accented by her fitted t-shirt and jeans, her hair in a braid hanging down her back. Flyaway tendrils frizzed around her head. His heart thumped as his eyes savored. He'd missed her today. He was tempted to forget his career and tell her right now that he longed to be near her and hoped she felt the same. But he pushed that idea aside. A week. He only had to wait a week until he could declare his feelings and hope she returned them. His gaze moved to the area where she worked. From the way Harper had talked, he expected a masterpiece to be on the hardboard. But it wasn't. He didn't think it was, anyway. Not like he was an art expert. He'd been a science major. The hardboard was no longer brown. It was white. And not flat any longer, but ridged and bumpy, textured. She finally saw him and stopped. Her eyes widened when she saw the food, and he thought he heard her stomach growl.
I didn't realize until just now that I'm starving.
She set the tools down and rinsed her hands off in a bucket of water. Her work area had things strewn everywhere. Paper, tools, water, bowls, brushes, and towels were all scattered haphazardly. Everything was splattered with a white, plaster-like substance. He smiled to himself. She needed him. Come on down. This stew smells delicious. She finished drying her hands on a plaster-splattered towel and hopped off the wagon.
Aren't you going to ask why I'm not painting?
Aren't you going to tell me?
Now that you asked, I decided last night, after I went to bed, that it would look more realistic if I added texture. But I needed a medium that would dry fast, although it doesn't necessarily have to be super strong or durable. After all, we're going to use it in the float, then it's bye-bye to everything, right?
She stopped in front of him and tilted her head. Yes, I don't see any point in keeping it. We make a new float every year. He refrained from wiping the spot of white plaster off the tip of her nose and handed her the bowl of stew instead.
Thanks,
she said, taking the bowl. Their fingers brushed, and little patters of electric shock tumbled up his hand.
That's what I thought. So anyway, the stuff I'm using fits the bill. I've got it textured like grass, and by the time we're done eating, we should be able to start painting.
He pulled his gaze from her lips and looked again at the whiteboard. I see the textures you're talking about. Looks like ridges running vertical. She nodded and swallowed.
Not straight, though. If you notice, the ridges are bent, like grass waving in the wind.
I see it.
I've got to get this done tonight, though, because tomorrow night we open the haunted barn.
I forgot. I was kind of hoping to see you at the football game. One tendril of hair curled by her cheek, and he clenched his fingers into a fist to keep from twirling it around his finger.
Oh, no, I definitely can't make that.
She sighed, looking at her bowl.
We'll be shorthanded this weekend for the haunted barn because of homecoming. 2 of the 5 kids who help out have already taken Friday and Saturday off.
Her shoulders slumped and she bit her lip. He had to go to the football game. He had to be at the dance, too. What about the parade Saturday evening? I assumed you'd be there.
No, the haunted barn starts at dark.
Why was he so disappointed Ellie wouldn't be at the parade? Maybe because they'd spent so much time working on the float together. He just assumed they'd watch it together. She set her empty bowl aside.
You know, I was thinking about that moon, that a frame with see-through white material stretched over it would be neat, and if we had some kind of stand, there could be a real couple silhouetted behind it, rather than cutouts.
I like that idea. The experience he'd gotten this week had maybe bolstered his confidence. I don't think that would be hard to make. She grinned.
Me either.
How about I see if I can search for some ideas on the internet? My laptop's in my briefcase in the car.
Sounds good.
Her eyes crinkled as he picked up her bowl.
Missed you today.
His heart leaped in his chest. Then it settled when he realized she was talking about him cleaning up for her. Every time I come back, you're surrounded by another disaster area.
That's my life.
Friday morning, Ellie parked in front of Fink's office just as the bell rang. Harper had already jumped out, and when the bell stopped, the door was closing behind her. Through his office window, she saw Fink standing beside his desk, surrounded by at least 10 people. He'd mentioned something about families visiting today, so Ellie assumed they were the folks he was talking about. A stab of disappointment cut through her, and she smiled sadly at how pathetic she was. she'd actually put on nice clothes, a pair of beige slacks and a blue ruffled blouse that made her eyes look extra blue, and took the time to somewhat tame her hair. For what? It wasn't like she had a chance with him or anything. She should drive away. There was no reason to stay or get out, but her hands rested on the steering wheel. She smiled as a child in his office took a Tootsie Roll from the candy container, and Fink reached down to straighten it without taking his eyes from the man speaking to him. She looked at her hands. They'd finished the float last night. Everything was ready for whoever was crowned king and queen, and Harper and Wyatt had agreed to ride on the float on the platform behind the moon and be the silhouettes. Fink hadn't said anything about coming over tonight after the game, and she'd be busy anyway. She wouldn't see him until tomorrow at the parade. Well, she wasn't getting anything done here. She put her pickup in gear and eased out, unable to resist one last look in Fink's window. He had turned his head, and their eyes met as she pulled away from the curb. Heat curled in her belly, and her chest tightened. His lips turned up, and he nodded once. She lifted a hand. Then she was past his window. Feeling like she was leaving a part of herself behind, she deliberately pushed on the accelerator. Chapter 12. Ellie sat in her little shop finishing up her fourth wreath of the day when her phone buzzed with a text. She jumped, knocking a spool of ribbon onto the floor. "Drat!" she muttered as she scrambled after it, not wanting it to get dirty as it rolled out over the floor. Her phone continued to buzz while she caught the ribbon and rolled it back up. Both texts were from Harper. "I am homecoming queen." The second one was in all caps. "The king is Wyatt." Ellie squealed and did a little happy dance. Harper had never said anything about wanting to be queen, and Ellie suspected she didn't really care. But Wyatt had struggled to fit in at the beginning of the year, and the fact that he'd been voted king said to her that he'd managed to make the adjustment quite well. She texted back, "Congratulations," then realized Harper and Wyatt were supposed to stand behind the moon, but they'd be sitting as king and queen on the float. Mom and Dad would probably be willing to be the silhouettes on the float. All she had to do was find someone else to help with the haunted house. Her stomach growled. Lunchtime. But she wanted to finish this last wreath before she knocked off. Usually there were enough customers after lunch to prohibit any meaningful work getting done. She had just tightened the elaborate orange bow when her phone buzzed again. A text from Fink. "Harper probably told you Wyatt and she are homecoming king and queen. You and I can stand behind the moon." Ellie smiled. She read the text again, just because it was from Fink. Then, deciding she'd make something work out with the personnel at the farm, she answered, "That's fine." Almost immediately, Fink texted back, "I have a surprise for the float. I'll bring it over after the game. You can put me to work." What surprise could he have? "You bet I will. You can rescue lost kids from the corn maze. There are always a lot of them on weekend nights." She hesitated before adding, "What surprise?" "You'll see." She chuckled, sure that it wouldn't matter how much she begged. If Fink didn't want to tell her, he wouldn't be persuaded. Soon, another text came through. "Come to the game at halftime to see Harper crowned. I'll meet you at the gate." This was a once-in-a-lifetime event for Harper. The farm would just have to make do without her for an hour while she went to see her daughter. She typed back,
Okay, give me the surprise then.
Nope. She shook her head at her phone. Crazy man. Anticipation lit her insides, and not wholly because of Harper being queen. She couldn't wait to see Fink. Chapter 13. Ellie squinted from the glare of the bright lights and scanned the crowd at the gate, searching for Fink's distinctive dark hair. The smell of hot dogs mixed with the tangy scent of fall leaves. Kids of various ages ran around. Younger ones played on the monkey bars, laughing, yelling, and chasing each other, here to play with their friends and not to watch the football game. Just like she'd done ever since Ellie had been in school, Mrs. Herschel took tickets at a brightly lit table under a canopy tent. 100 yards away, down the hill and across the field, the crowd cheered. The loudspeaker crackled with a man's excited voice. The field lights cut through the darkness, giving the impression of daylight. She checked out the people coming and going between the field and the gate. There weren't many, and Fink was not among them.
Hello, Mrs. Herschel,
Ellie said as she stepped up to the table.
Ellie, dear, Mr. Finkenbinder said you might be coming.
Mrs. Herschel slid her glasses down her nose and searched the area around the field as Ellie had just done.
I don't see him right now, and I do know he had a group of people to entertain.
Her kind hazel eyes landed back on Ellie.
How are you, dear?
The wind ruffled her curly silver hair. She hunched down deeper into her baby blue sweatshirt. Ellie smiled.
I'm fine. When Mr. Finkenbinder mentioned you, I was a little surprised. I never thought you two got along that well.
She looked over her glasses at Ellie.
We've been working together on the float this week, and we've declared a truce of sorts.
What she felt for Fink went deeper than a truce, but getting into it with Mrs. Herschel would be uncomfortable. Just standing here in the noise and the dark and the wind and the smells took her back 18 years. She had a vague sense of being a lost kid, pregnant, alone, and scared. She shrugged the feeling off. She was an adult now and had successfully raised that unexpected blessing. Today she had nothing to be uncomfortable about.
I'll just mosey down. Tell him I was here if he shows up. If you wait, honey, I'll go with you. We don't charge people after the second quarter.
Ellie glanced at the tent and the table.
Are you taking the stuff down? Yes, and I'll have to run the cash box over and lock it in my trunk. You do that, and I'll have this down by the time you get back.
After taking the table and the tent down, she set them by the fence. Then she unplugged the light and wound up the extension cord. Look at that neat pile. Wouldn't Fink be proud of her? Squinting down the hill, she still didn't see him.
Oh, that's perfect, dear. Thanks so much. That canopy is a bear for me to get down by myself.
Mrs. Herschel shuffled back.
It was kind of heavy. I can't believe you do it by yourself. Actually, honey, I don't. Usually Mr. Finkenbinder and Jordan are here to help. Sometimes he has a whole crowd of boys around him. I seldom lift a finger.
She chuckled as they started down the hill. Fink hadn't really struck her as the type of school administrator who was popular with the students. But, come to think of it, Harper had always liked him. And, come to think of it again, kids often tapped his office window and waved at him. She'd assumed they did it to irritate him, leaving handprints and all. But maybe they did it because they liked him.
You know, Mr. Finkenbinder is a good man. but he's always alone. I worry about him."
Mrs. Herschel stumbled a bit, and Ellie said,
"Here, grab my arm." "Oh, you're sweet."
her gloved fingers gripped tighter than Ellie would have thought possible.
"But with his nephew showing up this fall."
Curious about the secretary's perspective on him, Ellie listened closely.
"Now today he has me looking for his lady friend. That's never happened before either. I think you and Mr. Finkenbinder could work out. You'll soften his rough edges and he'll give you structure."
Mrs. Herschel sighed the sigh of old lady matchmakers everywhere. Ellie didn't have the heart to remind Mrs. Herschel that she wasn't good enough for Fink. She didn't want to say it at all. It hurt to think that she didn't measure up, that she needed a piece of paper attached to her name to make her worthy. She steadied Mrs. Herschel as they crossed a small ditch and headed toward the home side bleachers. The crowd cheered and her head turned toward the field. Of course, she could leave the farm and take art classes. Now that Harper was graduating in the spring, she was no longer tied to the farm for her daughter. Harper was already accepted at Penn State, and she planned to commute for the first year, so she'd be around to help with the farm. If she went after her art dream, she would have to leave her in-laws with all the farm work. She wasn't sure she wanted to do that. The thought caused a vague uneasiness to slide through her. Art school might have been her dream at one time, but it wasn't what she wanted anymore. She loved the farm and, if she were honest, didn't want to leave. They stopped at the foot of the crowded bleachers.
"Oh, there he is."
Mrs. Herschel pointed to a group of well-dressed people at the bottom of the stands. Fink sat beside a woman in an elegant, dressy coat. Ellie's heart seized. Dr. Danielle Rothschild. Until Ellie had dropped out, they'd been in the same class. Friends in elementary school. Competitors in high school. Enemies after Liam chose Ellie over Danielle. Even from here, Ellie could see that her hair was perfectly coiffured. It shone in the lights. She held herself with an aristocratic bearing that bespoke confidence and class. Danielle said something and Fink laughed. Ellie's chest tightened. Maybe she didn't particularly want to go to art school, or even to leave the farm, but she wasn't sure she wanted to stay and be reminded every time she saw Fink of how she didn't measure up either. Wishing she'd put on something a little fancier than the clothes she'd been working in, she nodded at Mrs. Herschel.
"I see him." "Oh, good, because there's my husband. I'm going to scoot on up to him. He's saved me a seat right beside him."
Which was more than Fink had done. He had the aristocratic woman on one side of him and a woman with a small child on her lap on the other. Mrs. Herschel dropped her hand from Ellie's arm.
"I know he's expecting you. He said so, honey,"
she murmured, as though she sensed Ellie's hesitation. She nodded.
"Thanks, Mrs. Herschel." "Go get him, Ellie, dear."
The little lady nodded at Fink.
"He needs someone like you in his life."
Ellie smiled, like she assumed she was supposed to, and Mrs. Herschel climbed the bleacher steps. Tempted to turn tail and run, Ellie glanced at the field before taking a deep breath and plunging through the students standing at the rail in front of the bleachers. Cheerleaders chanted and danced in front of them as she wound her way through. Most of the people in the stands were dressed like her, sweatshirts and jeans, minus the work boots. So Fink's group, in their dress coats, pressed slacks, and good shoes, stood out. She was only 20 feet away when he glanced up from his conversation with the woman holding the child, and his eyes met Ellie's. The serious expression melted away, and a grin split his face. He stood, belatedly looking down and mouthing "excuse me" to the woman who had still been talking. She waited while he scooted around the group he was with and strode toward her. "Ellie, I'm sorry you walked over by yourself. There's 2 minutes and 47 seconds left in the half. I was making myself wait until the 2-minute mark to walk over." He grinned. "I didn't think you'd be early." Okay, so he had a good point there. She did have a reputation for tardiness. She returned his smile, pleased that he'd acted a little like it had been days, rather than hours, since he'd last seen her.
Mrs. Herschel walked over with me.
She shrugged.
I'm a big girl, though, really. I can be by myself.
Well, I know your in-laws couldn't make it with you. I mean, I assumed they needed to stay at the farm and keep things going.
Yeah, they were disappointed that they couldn't come, but it's the sacrifice you make when you own a business.
They had insisted that she go. She hadn't put up much of an argument. "Come on over here and sit down. Do you mind?" he added as an afterthought.
Not at all. Thanks for including me. This will be perfect to see Harper.
She almost thought he was going to take her hand, but he stuck his hand in his pocket instead, leading her to where he'd been sitting. "Dr. Rothschild, this is Ellie Bright. Her daughter, Harper, is homecoming queen, and she's going to watch the ceremony with us." Danielle's lips flattened as her cold blue eyes narrowed. Her gaze skimmed over Ellie's work attire.
Ellie and I know each other,
Danielle said coolly. Fink's brows furrowed. Ellie lifted her chin and held her hand out.
It's been a while, Danielle.
She glanced at Fink.
Until I quit, we were in the same class in school.
Danielle used 3 fingers and touched Ellie's hand with light pressure. Her mauve fingernails glinted in the light. Her gaze, narrow and calculating, slid to Fink before landing back on Ellie.
Congratulations on your daughter's election.
If one could look down one's nose while looking up at a person, Danielle had accomplished it.
Thanks.
Ellie tried to sound sincere. "Do you mind sliding over, and she and I will sit on the end?" Fink asked. Danielle moved her posterior over, and Fink indicated for Ellie to sit beside her. By the time Ellie got settled and looked up, only a few seconds were left in the half. Fink leaned over to her ear. "I'm so glad you could make it. I think Harper's pretty excited."
I bet she is. I've texted her, but it's Friday, which is always busy at the farm, and I haven't talked to her. She wasn't even set on going to the dance, since we're short-handed, so we'll actually have to go shopping tomorrow for a dress.
Ellie hadn't figured out how they were going to accomplish that. Saturdays were busy all day. "Want me to come out in the morning for a while to help out?" Her head spun around. She almost bumped his nose with hers. He was that close.
Would you?
"Of course. I owe you." He lowered his voice. "These people really sound interested in our district, and the float you've made will only be an asset."
Is there something special about these people?
"They've got money." He shrugged.
I see.
The wind gusted, and she reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. Fink captured her hand with his own. He kissed her knuckle before tucking their clasped hands into his jacket pocket. Her eyes widened.
People might see.
"It's hard to care. You're so beautiful with your bright cheeks and flashing eyes. Natural. It's magnetic." She couldn't believe Fink was holding her hand. He squeezed it, and they shared a smile before the loudspeaker crackled, announcing the royalty parade. If someone had told her she'd be watching her daughter ride around the Chestnut Hill football field in the back of a pickup as homecoming queen, she might have believed it. If they added that Ellie would be holding Mr. Finkenbinder's hand while she watched, she'd have laughed in their face. But she was, and it felt perfect. After the announcements ended, the royalty were introduced, and the parade looped the track. The loudspeakers squawked with calls to support the boosters by purchasing food at their stand, and people began getting up and walking around.
"I better get going,"
she said, but couldn't seem to get her butt to leave the seat. "I'll walk you out."
"You don't need to."
"But I can if I want to."
"Of course."
He stood, letting go of her hand, but putting his on the small of her back after she stood. He faced Danielle. "Ellie has to go back to work. I'm walking her out. Would you like anything? A burger or fries or drink?"
"No, thank you,"
Danielle said through pinched lips.
"She doesn't like me much,"
Ellie said after they'd reached the bleacher steps and started down. "She doesn't like me either, but she's the president of the school board, and I need her vote on Wednesday." Ellie had gotten a different impression of Danielle's affections for Fink, but she kept her mouth shut. A gangly teen rushed up the steps, tripping, and knocked into Ellie. She lost her balance and stumbled into Fink. He grabbed her to keep her from falling off the last 2 steps. "Mr. Reams, watch yourself," he said to the teen.
"I'm sorry, Mr. F. Ma'am, are you okay?"
The kid's face was solid red, and he shuffled his large feet.
"I'm fine."
Ellie had caught her balance with no harm done, but Fink again had a hold of her hand. This time, their linked hands were not in his pocket. "Be careful, Mr. Reams, and don't run on the bleachers."
"Yes, sir, Mr. F."
The boy turned and continued up the stairs, slowly. Fink looked down at Ellie. "Are you really okay? He hit you pretty hard."
"I'm fine, really."
She stared into his eyes, breathless, but not from getting bumped by a high school boy. It had more to do with Fink holding her hand in plain view of everyone. "Let's go." He finished descending the stairs, and their fingers stayed entwined. After skirting the edge of the track, they started up the hill. Students and parents alike greeted Fink as they passed. More than one raised an eyebrow. Figuring he must not realize they were still linked, she tried to pull her hand away. He tightened his fingers and looked down at her. He lifted their hands. "This bothers you?"
"I thought you didn't realize. I don't mind at all."
"I realize." His hand squeezed hers. "Maybe you should mind, because I wanted to take you behind the bleachers and do more than just hold your hand." Her eyes popped open.
"Fink?
How could anyone spend the week working with you and not fall under your spell?"
"Spell?"
He shook his head. "It must be a spell. I've been working toward the superintendent position for almost 15 years, trying to shuck the farm boy from Iowa image. But right now, I don't care about that, or Dr. Rothschild, or the families thinking about choosing to relocate to our district. Any of it. I want to leave with you, be with you. I don't even recognize myself. That's some spell."
"I'm shocked."
His mouth tightened. It was much less crowded this close to the gate, but Fink was quiet as they passed a high school couple walking in, holding hands. He turned, maybe to make sure the couple was out of earshot, before he walked through the gate with her. Then he pulled her over toward an equipment shed, out of the light. "You could say, Fink, I feel the same about you," he said roughly.
"I thought you knew it."
"Aren't we having this conversation backward? Isn't it the woman who's supposed to say, 'I need to hear the words'? And the man who says, I told you once, and if anything changes, I'll let you know." She laughed, as maybe he intended. He pulled her hand, spinning her until her back was against the dark side of the shed. He moved closer, releasing her hand to wrap his around her waist, his other hand in her hair. "I saw you leaving this morning, and my whole body ached to talk to you, touch you. Actually, I had a whole group of people in my office, and all I could think about was running after you and doing this." His mouth covered hers. She kissed him back eagerly. Her arms went around his neck, pulling him closer. He groaned. She caught the sound in her mouth, savoring it. He wanted her. He'd thought about kissing her. Holy cow, he was kissing her. Even with the passion that had erupted in her chest, she couldn't contain her giggle. He lifted his head, his breathing choppy. His hand splayed flat on the shed wall beside her head. "My kissing is funny?"
Gosh, no, never. My head is spinning and I can't think, but I don't want you to stop."
You laughed.
"I'm making out with the principal behind the equipment shed. It has a surreal quality to it."
I see. His thumb traced down her cheek, along her jawline. Surreal in a good way? His voice was tender, but a little uncertain. Her heart leaped in response. She pulled him closer, standing on tiptoe to kiss his hard jaw.
"The best way."
He growled, and his mouth came back down on hers. His hand slid over her t-shirt. She shivered and pushed closer. His fingers spanned her waist, but he pulled his head back and rested his forehead on hers. "I was going to wait until Thursday. I didn't want anything to interfere with the decision for superintendent, but I spent the day thinking it didn't matter if I even got the position anymore. As principal, I have summers off and could help you on the farm. As superintendent, that would be impossible." He took a deep breath. "That's making an awful big assumption that you want me to help."
"I want you,"
She pulled back.
"but I don't want you to miss out on a career opportunity because of being seen with me."
It hurt to say it, hurt to think people might think less of him for being with her. But small-town folk had long memories. No one had forgotten she'd gotten pregnant at 15 and never finished high school. Was that the type of person they wanted their school superintendent to marry? For the most part, probably not. He held her chin and seemed to search her eyes in the darkness. "Didn't you hear me say I don't care?"
"But I do."
He huffed. "Are we still on the float tomorrow night?"
"Yes. Dad needs to be at the farm, so our neighbor is driving the tractor."
"As long as we're together behind the moon." She laughed and cupped his cheek with her hand.
"Please don't allow me to stand between you and the superintendent position."
"Please don't push me away just because I have a degree and a position in the school administration." Ellie froze. That could be true. She might be just as bigoted as she'd been accusing him of being.
"If I'm pushing you away, it's not because you have an education. It's because I don't."
Isn't that the same as if I were to push you away because I do and you don't? His fingers traced down her cheek.
"I expect that."
Does that make it right?
"It's normal."
You're not judging me as a man on my merits, but only on some slip of paper I have. Her mouth opened and closed.
"I'm sorry. I didn't realize, but that's exactly what I was doing.
She leaned her head against the shed. A lot of times, we're blind to our own prejudices. I know I was.
Willfully blind.
Had she been prejudiced?
Maybe when you think that other people are judging you, it's easier to judge them back rather than turn the other cheek.
Maybe. He lowered his head and nuzzled her cheek. She turned her head, meeting his lips. His hand moved on her waist, and she slid both hands into his open jacket. He was solid muscle, and her fingers tingled as they learned his shape through his dress shirt. He pressed closer, and their kiss deepened. She heard a moan, and she honestly wasn't sure if it was him or her.
Mr. Finkenbinder?
Ellie jerked back, recognizing the feminine voice. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.